Oscar Wilde was born on October 16, 1854, in Dublin, Ireland. He is the second son of Sir William Wilde and Jane Wilde. Sir William Wilde was an Irish eye and ear surgeon who was knighted for his service as a medical advisor. Jane Wilde, also Lady Wilde, worked as a poet under the pen name Speranza and was known to be associated with the Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848. Oscar Wilde graduated Portora Royal School in 1871 and entered Trinity College in Dublin with Royal School Scholarship. While in Trinity College studying classics, Wilde earned a foundation scholarship through competitive examination and Berkeley Gold Medal, the highest academic award in Greek. He graduated Trinity College in 1874 and earned Demyship Scholarship into Magdalen College in Oxford, which he graduated in 1878. Wilde married Constance Lloyd on May 29, 1884, and he had two sons, Cyril, who was born in 1885, and Vivian, born in 1886. Oscar Wilde is known for his support for the art movement called aestheticism, which emphasized beauty over moral values in art. He supported this principle since his undergraduate years in Trinity College and later wrote essays arguing for aestheticism. His acclaimed works include The Picture of Dorian Gray, his only novel which received harsh criticism from his contemporaries for its decadence, and plays like A Woman of No Importance, An Ideal Husband, and The Importance of Being Earnest. In the year of 1895, Oscar Wilde went through 3 trials against Marquis of Queensberry, and as a result, he was imprisoned for 2 years from 1895 to 1897. He wrote Ballad of Reading Gaol during his imprisonment. After his release, he was broke because of the legal costs, and he was physically and mentally prostrated by his imprisonment. Wilde died on November 30th, 1990. He died of meningitis, which probably developed from the head injury he got while in prison. The 3 trials between Oscar Wilde and Marquis of Queensberry remain controversial even today because of its unprecedented cruelty. I'm going to first explain how it happened and point out some parts that are unusual and noteworthy. In the summer of 1891, Oscar Wilde met a handsome young man named Alfred Douglas, and the two became very close. Lord Alfred Douglas's father, John Sholto Douglas, also the Marquis of Queensberry, who often quarreled with his son, soon disapproved the relationship between Alfred Douglas and Oscar Wilde. Marquis of Queensberry, known to be arrogant and ill-tempered, bullied Oscar Wilde, threatening the restaurant and hotel managers who served Wilde, appearing in Wilde's house without warning and insulting him. On February 14, 1895, Marquis of Queensberry brought a bouquet of rotten vegetables to insult Wilde during the opening night's performance of Wilde's successful play, The Importance of Being Earnest at St. James Theatre, but he was blocked by the police. Days later, Marquis of Queensberry wrote to Oscar Wilde, posing as a sodomite, on a card and left it to Albemarle's Club's porter, telling him to deliver it to Wilde. Upon receiving the card, Wilde decided to prosecute Marquis of Queensberry for libel. The first trial of Oscar Wilde was proceeded on April 3, 1895 at Old Bailey. Edward Clarke as Oscar Wilde's attorney and Edward Carson, Oscar Wilde's old rival from Trinity College in Dublin, defending Queensberry. During the cross-examination between Edward Carson and Oscar Wilde, Carson first brought Wilde's writings, his letters to Alfred Douglas, and the portrait of Dorian Gray as the evidence. Oscar Wilde cleverly defended himself against Carson by arguing his principle of aestheticism, separating art from the real life. To Oscar Wilde, what he wrote cannot be used against him to prove his behavior in real life. For example, from the picture of Dorian Gray, Carson quotes Basil Hallward, a painter in the novel who paints a young and beautiful man named Dorian Gray, explaining his feeling toward Dorian Gray. Then he asks Wilde, "May I take it that you, as an artist, have never known the feeling described here?" To which Oscar Wilde responded, "I have never allowed any personality to dominate my art, separating real life from art and elevating art over the real life." Wilde became uncomfortable when Carson brought factual evidences against Wilde, such as the gifts that Wilde gave to his young companions. After Carson announced that he was going to call the young men who were sexually associated with Wilde to the witness box, Edward Clark, Oscar Wilde's attorney, convinced his client to withdraw the prosecution. Right after the first trial, Queensberry's solicitor submitted to the Director of Public Prosecutions the copies of the statements of the young men who were procured by Queensberry as witnesses. The warrant to arrest Oscar Wilde was issued, and Marquess of Queensberry prosecuted Oscar Wilde for gross indecency. On April 26, 1895, Oscar Wilde, along with Alfred Taylor, the procurer of young men for Wilde, were charged of 25 counts of gross indecencies and conspiracy to commit gross indecencies. The prosecutor was Charles Frederick Gill, and Edward Clark defended Oscar Wilde pro bono, Oscar Wilde being unable to afford the legal fee for the libel trial. Oscar Wilde had to suffer the parade of young male witnesses who testified that they committed gross indecencies with Wilde. During the cross-examination, which was held in the fourth day of the trial, Prosecutor Charles Gill asked Oscar Wilde about Lord Alfred Douglas's poem Two Loves, asking him what the love that dare not speak its name meant. Oscar Wilde's response to this question evoked loud applause from the crowd. The jury failed to reach the verdict, and Wilde was released on bail for 3 weeks before his second criminal trial on May 22nd. The second trial lasted from May 22nd to May 25th. The trial was prosecuted by Solicitor General Frank Lockwood, and this time the jury reached the verdict of guilty, sentencing Oscar Wilde to 2 years imprisonment with hard labor. There are a few things to be pointed out about these trials. First, the court was determined to prosecute Oscar Wilde, accepting evidences that undermined the rule of evidence. The main evidence used against Wilde was witness testimonies from the young men who testified that they engaged in gross indecencies with Wilde. The question of how these witnesses were acquired should follow. It is very likely that Marquess of Queensberry threatened these witnesses, and indeed, some claim that these young men were paid inflated fees to testify against Wilde, and that they sounded as if they were trained to testify in the witness box. These young men were not punished for their crimes of gross indecencies and extortion. If Marquess of Queensberry threatened the witnesses and paid them inflated money, these evidences are acquired through paralegal means, which should not be accepted into court. Also, the court allowed witness testimonies from the chambermaids and hotel staff that should have been counted not substantial. The testimonies from the maids and the hotel staff contained hearsay evidences and statements about Wilde's messy room and his bed sheets that are directed more toward humiliating Wilde than proving his crime. Moreover, the sentence that Oscar Wilde received is unprecedented, considering the unusually harsh procession and the verdict against Oscar Wilde. The question remains why the court was so set to prosecute and punish him. Some scholars assume that rather than for gross indecency, Oscar Wilde was punished by the Victorian society more for his behaviors that deviated from the accepted norm. Another interesting point is that Oscar Wilde had the chances to avoid his criminal trials, but he still decided to face them. Before the libel trial, Wilde's friends advised him not to carry out the prosecution against the Marquis of Queensberry. However, Alfred Douglas intervened that Wilde should not run away from his fight against the Marquis. Before his arrest for his first criminal trial, Wilde had little more than an hour to catch a train to the continent, the last chance to escape to France, where his behavior would be more tolerated. At this moment, Oscar Wilde was in a state of indecision, but at last he decided to stay and face the trial. During the trials, the passages from his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, was used against him, but Wilde defended himself by arguing for his literary principle, art for art's sake. The Picture of Dorian Gray was first published in the July number of Lippincott's monthly magazine in 1890. The novel received harsh criticisms from the contemporary literary critics for its decadence and homoerotic undertone. The year after its publication, Oscar Wilde published the preface and the extended version of the novel. The preface to Picture of Dorian Gray contains Oscar Wilde's view on aestheticism. In his preface, Wilde argues that the artist is the creator of beautiful things. To reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. Also that there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book, and that all art is quite useless. To Oscar Wilde, work of art, whether its medium is language or not, should be admired for its beauty and not be used as a tool to propagate moral values. However, Oscar Wilde's aestheticism in his novel The Picture of Dorian Gray is not without contradictions. Some of the comments by the characters in his novel seem to reflect Oscar Wilde's own moralistic opinions. For example, Lord Henry Wotton states, "I suppose it comes from the fact that none of us can stand other people having the same faults as ourselves. The masses feel that drunkenness, stupidity, and immorality should be their own special property, and that if any one of us makes an ass of himself, he is poaching on their preserves." Also, Lord Henry Wotton gives his thoughts about his aristocratic friends, whose conversation would have been about the feeding of the poor and the necessity for model lodging houses. Each class would have preached the importance of those virtues for whose exercise there was no necessity in their own lives. These lines seem to reflect Oscar Wilde's own moralistic view on the masses' hypocritical outrage toward the petty faults of those in power and the aristocrats' pretension of care for those in need. These views are not useless as Oscar Wilde claims all art should be. The plot of the novel also seems to contain moral messages from Oscar Wilde, which should not be there according to Wilde's aestheticism. In the novel, what a person does affects how he appears, but for Dorian Gray, a beautiful young man, the effects of his sins are all directed towards the painting of Dorian Gray, painted by Basil Hallward. At the end, Dorian Gray makes the mistake of confusing art, the portrait of himself, and the real life, his morality, and attempts to remedy his fault by destroying the art. The whole theme of the real-life event affecting the appearance, the beauty of the person and also a painting, and Dorian Gray's fatal end for his mistake of confusing art with morality seem to make the novel moralistic, which contradicts Wilde's aestheticism.